I have no idea how to live the rest of my life. I've already thought about using fish hooks and a fishing line to keep my eyes wide open. I have only to blink as the creature gets one step closer to me. It feeds on my fear, and it likes to be looked at its terrible twisted grimace that causes only disgust and incredible animal horror. I don't know how it appeared here, in my apartment. I don't know what it needs, and why it is so interested exactly in me. I haven't been sleeping or eating properly for a week. The incredible horror has already managed to force me to change my housing this week, but it doesn't help. I've already been in the church, asked the witches and other charlatans for help, but they didn't even want to talk to me. Something inexplicable began to happen in my life, and I still don't know what to do with it. For a week now, I have been waking up at night from nightmares, sleeping behind a closed door, and with the light on in the bedroom. Every time before going to bed, I lock the bedroom door with 2 locks, and this is despite the fact that I live alone. I have become too irritable. I don't communicate with many people, and every evening, locking myself in my bedroom, I drink at least 5 shots of vodka to somehow calm my nerves and not be afraid to close my eyes when I go to bed. Because if I fall asleep when it's still light outside, then maybe I will be able to avoid meeting him. As I said a little earlier, it all started a week ago. It was a very ordinary evening of a very ordinary Thursday. I was so tired that I could barely move my legs. I was returning home from work, and my only desire in those seconds was to open the door to the apartment as quickly as possible, undress, and go to bed without even taking a shower. I was working at a construction site then, and I was physically tired, so that was all I wanted. At that time, I still didn't understand that it was the last day I worked at that facility. Having barely climbed to my floor, I entered the apartment, and turning on the light in the hallway, took off my shoes and went into the room. After all, I need to wash at least my face, as I am too dirty to sleep like that, I thought, and undressing, I still took a shower. Soon, I was already lying in bed with my eyes closed. I had only to touch the pillow a little as my mind began to fog up and gradually sink into sleep. The clock was already beginning the 2nd hour of the night when a suspicious sound that flew into my bedroom from the kitchen pulled me out of a sweet slumber. For some reason, I heard it very clearly even though I was already asleep. My eyes opened wide, and I peered into the darkness. Apart from the blurred outline of the doorway, I couldn't see anything else. After wiping my eyes properly, I stared into the darkness of the room again, and something flashed in that very doorway. I thought that my heart would stop at that second. I shrank into the bed like a frightened child, covering myself with a blanket, and it was at that moment that I felt I was not alone in the apartment. Yeah, my terrible story began that very night. After lying for some time under a heavy cotton blanket, I still leaned out from under it and again looked around the dark room. The inexplicable feeling of someone's presence in the apartment was growing with every second. It made me uneasy. The inexplicable feeling of someone's presence in the apartment was growing with every second. I wanted to get out of bed and run away from here as far as possible. But no, I couldn't do it. And what if there is someone there, in the corridor, standing and waiting for me? Come on, you fool, I mentally said to myself. Well, who can be here except yourself? Don't act like a child. My own imagination made me shiver with fear. After these thoughts, that anxious feeling began to gradually disappear, and taking myself in hand, I got out of bed to make sure I was alone in the apartment. The old sofa creaked all over the room, and I got to my feet. Having once again looked around the room with a glance, taking a full breath of air, I confidently walked towards the hallway. As soon as I left the room, my former confidence instantly disappeared, as if it had never existed at all. The switch was very close. It was only necessary to stretch out my hand. But for some reason, I didn't turn on the light then. The silhouette standing in the hallway, right next to the front door, completely turned off my brain, instilling in it only a feeling of sticky and nasty fear. The switch was the last thing I thought about in those seconds. The silhouette stood motionless, even in this pitch darkness, and since my eyes were already accustomed to it, I could clearly see the sudden guest. "Who are you? What do you need?" I shouted, thinking that a man was standing in front of me, and remembering whether I had closed the front door when I was returning home. The stranger was silent and didn't move, but exactly until I blinked. Only my eyelids dropped for a split second. I clearly saw how something that was standing in the dark moved. It took a small step forward, and its right arm rose to shoulder level, making a nasty crack like the sound of breaking branches. I blinked again and looked away from it a little, and again I heard a crack. It came out of the shadow of the hallway and froze, already holding out its other hand. Now I saw this nightmare very well. There were no curtains in the kitchen, and the light from the street lamp easily made its way into my apartment and illuminated the creature standing in the corridor. Right. The creature was the only word I could choose to describe what suddenly appeared in my apartment. His thin, long, matted hair hung down from his wrinkled, wrung-out head. It stood bent to the ground, so much so that a normal person would have twisted into such a position. The horror that I experienced then is simply impossible to describe in words. In the grave silence of the apartment, I could hear only the beating of my heart and its hoarse and incredibly creepy, heavy breathing. Staring at it, I couldn't even allow myself to blink, already subconsciously realizing that as soon as I look away, it starts to move, and nobody knows what will happen when it gets to me. Panicked fear prevented me from collecting my thoughts, so I haven't even turned on the light yet. My arms and legs seemed to be paralyzed, so I stood in the corridor like a statue, rooted to the spot. I was afraid as never before in my life. I was afraid to look away from that creature and heard that same crackling of breaking branches again. The only thing I could do was stand there and wait for a miracle. I completely lost track of time that night, and yes, I still got to the switch and turned on the light, hoping that the creature would disappear. But no, it continued to stand as if nothing had happened. Unable to hold on any longer, I still blinked, but I tried to do it as rarely as possible. At each time, it came closer and closer. Each movement made my body tremble. Now, I could see where that crack was coming from. I could see how its arms were breaking out of different directions, and how it was randomly turning its head trying to find me. And so it was until the morning, and when it began to dawn outside the window, I blinked once again, and only when I opened my eyes I saw the creature turning around, opening the door, and leaving the apartment without closing the door. After that, I had been standing motionless for several minutes, and only when I was sure it was gone, I allowed myself to move. My legs gave way and I fell to the floor, where I later fell asleep. I came to sense the next morning. The sun was already shining through the window. The apartment was bright and calm. Clutching my head, I got to my feet and staggered into the kitchen, going over in my mind what had happened that night. The door to the hallway was still open, which only indicated that I hadn't dreamed what had happened, and the night guest was really here. Just this thought made me shudder. Suddenly, it became cold, and my whole body was covered with billions of goosebumps. After making a coffee, I sat down on a stool, having the same thoughts in my head. Who was it? How did it get into my apartment? And what did he want from me? Obviously, I haven't found any answers. I spent the whole day at home, surfing through hundreds of forums and sites looking for answers to all the questions. But alas, I found nothing but fictional horror stories and other such shit. I took time off from work, saying that I was ill and wouldn't come. I was shaking all day because of the high temperature, and I spent the evening wrapped in a warm blanket with a cup of hot tea in my hands. I closed the front door with all the locks, propped it up with a drawer standing in the hallway. But it didn't help. Already lying down to rest, I heard someone pulling the door handle hard. It was the monster. I immediately realized that was the creature that came to me again. Suddenly, the door opened, and a chill from the entrance got into the apartment, along with what was behind the door. From the hallway, I heard the familiar crunch, and my heart began to pound in my chest like a jackhammer. I could feel it coming down the corridor, and I knew that if I didn't look at it, it would get to me very quickly. And then, God only knows what would happen to me. The silhouette appeared in the doorway and froze again. I was sitting on the bed and looking at it. Damn, it was so scary. These movements, the sounds that it emitted, simply drove me crazy in a bad sense of the word. It got to me too close that night. As I've already said a little earlier, I felt ill and my body began to let me down at the most inappropriate moment. I started sneezing. Accordingly, it is simply impossible to sneeze without closing your eyes. A few sneezes were enough for him to walk half the room, and now the creature was already standing almost next to the edge of my bed. When it finally got to my bed, I could already feel its drooping hair touching my face, and I was paralyzed, just like the previous night. I don't know what happened to my body when it appeared. Either it was an animal horror that covered me from head to toe, or it was done by the creature standing next to me. His fathomless black eyes seemed to look straight into my soul, and I was already holding on with the last of my strength so as not to look away or blink. It was already too close. In those terrible seconds, I was saved by a tablet lying under my pillow. With difficulty, I took it out. Without taking my eyes off the creature, I tried to find my photo in the hope that this would help me, and it helped. I turned the tablet screen to the creature, and after praying in my mind, I closed my eyes. I blinked, and nothing happened. The creature was still standing over me and didn't move. At that moment, it was a huge weight off my back, but the tablet didn't help me for long. After all, I completely forgot that the screen automatically turns off in some time. I realized that it went out when the creature moved and came even closer to me. Now its disgusting face was about 10 inches from my face, and I've never been so scared as I was then. I was already on the verge of a panic breakdown, and that night I had to look at it again until dawn. The end of this night was absolutely the same. The first rays of the sun broke through the window, and the creature turned around and left, still leaving the door open. How it got into my apartment is still a mystery to me. This time, I didn't manage to fall asleep. The next day, I was looking for contacts of people who were somehow familiar with real paranormal phenomenon and who were able to help me in some way. Having met several charlatans, in the evening, I miraculously got to an old woman who lived 70 kilometers from our city, in a small, dilapidated village. Her house was radically different from the offices which I visited before. Some so-called witches and healers refused to even talk to me as soon as I started with my story. When I approached, I saw an old rickety house, a small flower bed overgrown with weeds, and a creaking, crumbling door. Inside, all the walls were hung with icons and crosses, and on the shelves were jars of various herbs and tinctures. Our conversation was short. I would say very short. I didn't even have time to open my mouth as she herself told me what was going on. I only told about 2 terrible nights that I miraculously managed to survive. The old lady gave me a piece of advice.
Try to go to bed before sunset. It sees you not sleeping, and in fact, feeds on your fear. And if you're asleep by the time it comes, it'll just walk into an empty apartment, turn around, and leave.
She encouraged me, gave me a small icon, and closed the door behind me. After waiting for the bus in high spirits, I went home. I didn't get enough sleep that day, and before sunset, I expected to be snoring in my pillow, and so I did. I just crossed the threshold of my apartment, undressed, and immediately flopped into bed. What can I say? Grandma was right. That night, I slept like a dead man, and I didn't hear anyone. Only in the morning, I still found the door open and a mess in the hallway. It was the third night. In the following nights, the situation returned to its original position. Now, it has chosen a different tactic for itself. It came to me and started waking me up, throwing objects around loudly, making furniture noise, slamming doors, and neither tablet nor constantly burning light in the room didn't help me anymore. I still had to look at it without looking away. I went to the same granny again, hoping that she would at least tell me something, but all her tips consisted of only one thing, that I would pray and always hold that icon in my hand. Unfortunately, that wasn't a way out of my damn situation. Nothing could help me anymore. I have already tried to take sleeping pills to sleep soundly, but nothing happened. I was already giving up. It got to me last night. I took lots of sleeping pills and fell asleep like a baby, but in the middle of the night, the noise of kitchen equipment and furniture woke me up. And looking around the room, I immediately saw a wriggling creature in the doorway. My heart sank into my heels, and I stared at it, getting ready for a long night. But after a few minutes, I realized that something had got into my eye. This was the point of no return. I endured for a long time, but in the end, I closed my eyes in order to wipe them, and the creature, as if furious, rushed at me. Now, I felt its cold fingers on my neck. They were extremely strong. With every second, it became harder and harder for me to breathe. Everything blurred before my eyes. I tried to escape from the deadly embrace like a wounded animal from a hunting trap, but he was too strong. When he grabbed me, the rule of not blinking and looking at it no longer applied. The creature growled disgustingly, twisted and wriggled, strangling me. And at the moment when I was ready to fall asleep and not wake up again, I remembered about the icon that was lying under the pillow all this time. I reached it and grabbed it tightly with all my remaining strength. After I hit the creature on the head with an icon, its grip loosened. It emitted a heart-rending scream, and the place where the icon touched suddenly began to smoke. The creature climbed on the wall, and then on the ceiling, wagging its head in different directions. I grabbed my neck and ran out of the room, and soon from the apartment. A car leaving our yard was my salvation. I ran out onto the road, stopped it, and boldly jumped inside, asking the driver to go somewhere, just to get further from this house. I didn't return to this apartment again at night. Only the next day, I arrived and took everything I needed, hoping that it wouldn't reach me in another housing. Now, I'm sitting writing this story in another rented apartment. I don't know for whom and why, but still, I will only say that it came to me again last night. The front door was open, and in the hallway in the morning, I found scattered clothes and shoes. It seems to me that it will find me wherever I am. I don't want to die.